Close your eyes and imagine the world 25 centuries ago. Egypt stood proud along the Nile. Greece was just beginning to stir with philosophy and war. Babylon's ziggurats still kissed the heaven. Yet in the rugged highlands of Persia, far from the centers of power, a new force was quietly taking shape. At first, no one noticed. Persia was considered little more than a backwater. But that illusion would not last, because from this soil would rise an empire unlike anything the world had seen before. Here's the surprising part. Persia didn't rise because it was rich or blessed with fertile rivers like Egypt or Mesopotamia. It rose because it was hardened by struggle. Its lands were harsh, its mountains unforgiving, its deserts merciless. Life in Persia demanded resilience. It demanded unity. The people who survived there weren't soft. They were forged in difficulty, sharpened by necessity. And while powerful neighbors looked down on them, Persia was quietly preparing for something greater. Imagine being a child in those plains. You see caravans passing through, loaded with exotic goods heading toward Babylon, Lydia, or Assyria. You hear tales of mighty empires, of kings who built hanging gardens and armies that crushed their enemies with iron fists. And in your heart you feel something stir. Why not us? Why should Persia remain in the shadows, when its people are just as strong, just as capable, just as hungry for greatness? This is what makes Persia's rise so extraordinary. While other empires expanded through fear, Persia began with belief, a belief that obscurity was not their destiny, that they too could stand tall among giants. Their strength wasn't in grand cities or golden treasuries. It was in loyalty. It was in warriors who fought not just for conquest, but for the dream of a future where Persia mattered. And slowly, the world began to notice. These tribes who were once underestimated learned to organize. They learned to fight together, to move swiftly, to adapt where others built walls. Persia built unity. Where others ruled through cruelty, Persia began shaping an identity rooted in inclusion, a vision that would later become its greatest weapon. But at this stage, it was still fragile, still uncertain, still just a spark waiting for someone to fan it into flame. That someone would be Cyrus. But before Cyrus, there was the silence of centuries, the silence of a people ignored, dismissed, forgotten. And yet it was in that silence that the Persian Empire was born. Not in palace, not in wealth, but in the hearts of ordinary people who refused to be invisible. Because Persia's story doesn't begin with glory. It begins with hunger, with the determination of a forgotten power ready to rise. If you thought Persia was destined for greatness from the very start, think again. Its rise was anything but guaranteed. And in the next chapter, we'll see how one man, Cyrus the Great, transformed that fragile spark into a roaring fire that consumed half the known world. When history remembers Cyrus, it often paints him as larger than life, a conqueror, a liberator, a king whose vision stretched beyond the horizon. But before he was Cyrus the Great, he was simply Cyrus, a boy born into a world where Persia was dismissed, where his people were seen as insignificant. No one at the time could have predicted that he would rise to build one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. And yet, against all odds, that's exactly what he did. Here's what makes his story remarkable. Cyrus didn't just inherit greatness. He carved it out of betrayal, survival, and ambition. Born around 600 BCE, he was the grandson of Astyages, king of the Median Empire. According to legend, Astyages had a dream that Cyrus would one day overthrow him. Fearing this prophecy, he ordered the infant to be killed. But the execution never happened. The baby was secretly spared, hidden away, and raised in obscurity. The boy who should have been buried before his first breath instead grew into the very man his grandfather feared. Imagine being Cyrus, growing up with no idea that your blood carried both danger and destiny. He was raised among commoners, away from the splendor of a royal court. He learned resilience, humility, and the struggles of ordinary people. And when the truth of his heritage came to light, Cyrus did not shy away from it. He embraced it. He realized that his life was not an accident. It was a calling. But Cyrus wasn't like other kings of his age. While rulers like the Babylonians and Assyrians wielded fear like a weapon, Cyrus understood something deeper. He knew that real power wasn't just about swords and soldiers. Real power came from loyalty, from respect, from building an empire not on terror but on trust, and that philosophy would make him unstoppable. His first great move was against the very man who tried to destroy him, his grandfather Astyages. With the support of discontented Median nobles, Cyrus led a rebellion. The battle was fierce, but Cyrus emerged victorious. The Medes, who once ruled over the Persians, were now absorbed into a new, united power. For the first time in history, Persia was no longer the shadow of someone else's empire. It was the empire. From there, Cyrus moved swiftly. He defeated Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, whose riches were legendary. He turned his armies east, subduing powerful tribes and kingdoms, and then perhaps his most famous conquest, Babylon. But here's where Cyrus set himself apart. When Babylon fell in 539 BCE, Cyrus didn't slaughter its people or burn its temples. Instead, he walked into the city as a liberator. He freed captives, including the Jews who had been exiled there for decades. He restored religious practices, respected local customs, and presented himself not as a destroyer, but as a restorer. This wasn't just strategy. It was genius. By allowing conquered peoples to keep their gods, their traditions, and their dignity, Cyrus created something unprecedented, an empire where diversity wasn't crushed, but embraced. People didn't just bow to him out of fear, they followed him out of respect. That's why, in history, Cyrus is remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a ruler with a vision larger than himself. But don't mistake this for weakness. Cyrus was still a warrior. His campaigns were relentless, his armies disciplined, his ambition unshakable. He built an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, a territory so vast that it dwarfed every empire before it. And yet, he never forgot the lessons of his youth, that leadership meant more than domination. It meant unity. Imagine the transformation. A boy who should have died in infancy now stood as the ruler of millions. A people once dismissed as insignificant now commanded the respect of the world. The forgotten power had found its voice, and its voice was Cyrus. But even as Cyrus built something extraordinary, cracks were already forming beneath the surface. The very philosophy that made his empire strong, respect for diversity, inclusion of many peoples, also carried seeds of betrayal. Ambition would fester in his successors. Loyalty would fracture, and what Cyrus built through vision and mercy, others would begin to tear apart through greed and blood. If you thought Persia's glory was secure after Cyrus, think again. The dream of unity was fragile, and in the next chapter we'll uncover how those cracks began to spread, even as Persia reached for the heavens. When Cyrus built his empire, it felt like the world had been reshaped overnight. For the first time, nations that once waged endless wars against each other were bound together under one crown. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Lydians, and countless others, all stitched into a single fabric. On the surface, it looked like unity, an empire of harmony, diversity, and shared destiny. But beneath that grand vision, cracks were already forming. Here's the unsettling truth. Unity is never simple. It's fragile. Holding together dozens of cultures, languages, and religions wasn't just an achievement, it was a balancing act. Cyrus managed it through wisdom, tolerance, and respect. But the problem was this: not every ruler after him would carry the same philosophy. And even during his reign, the seeds of conflict were quietly taking root. Imagine living in this new empire as a Babylonian priest. One day, your temple doors are reopened, your gods honored again, and you're allowed to practice freely after years of oppression. To you, Cyrus is not a conqueror, he's a savior. But look at it from another perspective. As a Persian noble, suddenly you realize your king is giving away privileges, letting foreign customs flourish, and treating outsiders with the same respect as his own people. Pride begins to shift into suspicion. Resentment lingers. Unity, in this sense, was never a gift everyone welcomed. This is the paradox of the Persian Empire. What made it great also made it vulnerable. Respect for diversity meant that loyalty was conditional. A subject might praise Cyrus today, but tomorrow, under a weaker ruler, that same subject might revolt. The empire's strength lay in inclusion, and yet inclusion also made betrayal inevitable, and betrayal did come, even within Cyrus's family. His sons, Cambyses and Bardia, would inherit the throne after his death, but not without scandal, bloodshed and accusations of treachery. What Cyrus dreamed as a unified empire began to twist under ambition, and that twisting wasn't confined to his heirs. Governors and satraps, the officials who managed vast provinces, often acted like kings in their own right. Far from the royal court, they wielded armies, collected taxes, and grew drunk on power. For many, loyalty to Persia was little more than loyalty to themselves. Think about what that means. The empire that was celebrated as tolerant and merciful was also vulnerable to corruption, greed, and manipulation. In the shadows of Persepolis, court whispers turned into conspiracies. Behind the loyalty of satraps, ambition waited for a chance to strike. The dream of unity was always in danger of collapsing under its own weight. But in this fragile balance, something extraordinary also emerged. Persia became more than an empire of conquest. It became an empire of ideas. Roads stretched across the land, connecting distant cities. Trade flourished. Art, science, and religion mingled in ways the world had never seen. For a brief shining moment, the dream looked unstoppable. And yet, history teaches us that every dream has a price. Cyrus's vision created a foundation unlike anything before it, but it also set the stage for betrayals that would haunt Persia for generations. When unity is built on respect, it thrives under greatness. But the moment weakness appears, cracks turn into fractures, and fractures into collapse. So as Persia celebrated its golden age, shadows were already lengthening. The empire had risen from obscurity into glory, but glory is never secure. Behind the dream of unity, betrayal was waiting. And soon, in the heart of Persepolis itself, the palace walls would echo with secrets, scandals, and schemes powerful enough to bring kings to their knees. If you thought Persia's court was a place of splendor and peace, think again. In the next chapter, we step inside Persepolis, where unity gave way to intrigue and where betrayal wore a crown. When people picture Persepolis, they see perfection. Majestic columns rising toward the heavens, walls carved with rows of warriors and kings, staircases adorned with intricate reliefs showing subjects from every corner of the empire. It was more than a city, it was a symbol, a place where Persia declared to the world, "We are eternal." But behind the polished stone and dazzling ceremonies, Persepolis hid something far darker. It was not only a palace of kings, it was a nest of whispers, betrayals and power struggles that would shape the fate of the empire. Here's the unsettling part. On the surface, the Persian court seemed unified, loyal to the great king. Every satrap bowed. Every noble swore allegiance. But inside the palace, loyalty was currency, bought and sold in secret meetings, fragile promises, and carefully plotted schemes. The very men who toasted the king at his feasts could be the same men sharpening daggers behind closed doors. Imagine the atmosphere, a hall filled with gold and incense, music echoing across marble floors, servants gliding silently with wine. Yet in every shadow, courtiers leaned close, whispering rumors. Who would succeed the throne? Which general had grown too ambitious? Which queen or concubine held the king's ear? And most importantly, who could be trusted? The answer was often no one. Persian kings were surrounded not just by nobles and generals, but by eunuchs, advisors, and guards who controlled access to the throne. These figures, often invisible in the grand carvings of Persepolis, wielded immense influence. They could sway decisions, manipulate royal marriages, and turn brother against brother. To stand at the king's side was both the greatest honor and the most dangerous position, and danger was constant. A single rumor could mean death, A single whisper could ignite rebellion. History remembers the grandeur of Persepolis, but it often forgets that within those same walls betrayal was common. Sons plotted against fathers, brothers conspired against each other, queens fought for their children's place in succession. Eunuchs brokered secret deals, tipping the scales of power from one faction to another. Think of the pressure on a Persian king. He ruled millions across continents, yet he couldn't trust the very people closest to him. A general's loyalty might last only as long as his army prospered. A satrap's allegiance might vanish the moment he saw an opening for independence. Even the royal court itself, filled with celebration and spectacle, was little more than a stage where ambition played its endless game. But here's the cruel irony. The very system that allowed Persia to expand its delegation of power to satraps, its inclusion of diverse peoples, its respect for local traditions, also created endless opportunities for betrayal. Unity was proclaimed in the carvings of Persepolis, but in the chambers behind them, daggers were being sharpened. And yet somehow, Persia endured, not because it was free from betrayal, but because it was strong enough to survive. For every court intrigue that threatened to destabilize the empire, there was a ruler or a general who managed to hold it together, at least for a time. But holding it together was never easy, and with every betrayal, the cracks deepened. Persepolis was both a jewel and a trap. To the outside world, it radiated stability and power. To those inside, it was a place where trust died quietly, where loyalty had a price, and where ambition could topple dynasties. If you thought Persia's greatness was built only on vision and strength, think again. It was also built on the fragile art of surviving betrayal, and no king embodied that struggle more than Darius, a visionary who expanded the empire to its greatest heights, but whose rule was haunted by treachery from within. When Cyrus the Great carved Persia into history, he gave it life, but it was Darius who gave it form. To many, Darius was the true architect of the Persian Empire. He was the king who turned a sprawling collection of conquered lands into a functioning machine, an empire so vast that it stretched farther than any before it. And yet, for all his brilliance, Darius also planted the seeds of betrayal that would haunt Persia for centuries. Here's the astonishing part. Darius wasn't even next in line for the throne. After Cyrus came Cambyses, who ruled with cruelty and chaos, eventually spiraling into madness. When Cambyses died, a man claiming to be his brother Bardia took the crown, but whispers began to spread. Was this man truly Bardia or an impostor? Darius, a young noble and officer in the royal guard, seized the moment. He rallied 6 conspirators, assassinated the supposed Bardia, and claimed the throne for himself. The official story was that he saved Persia from a usurper, but many wondered, had Darius killed a fraud, or had he murdered the rightful king? From the very beginning, Darius's reign was marked by questions of legitimacy, and he knew it. That's why he moved quickly to secure his rule, not just with swords, but with vision. He reorganized the empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap loyal to him. He built roads that stretched for thousands of miles, allowing messages to travel across the empire in days instead of months. He created a standardized system of coinage, making trade flourish like never before. He even left inscriptions boasting of his accomplishments, carving his authority into stone so future generations would know his name. But Darius's genius was also his curse, because the more he centralized power, the more he fed the ambitions of those beneath him. Satraps grew rich and powerful, ruling their provinces like miniature kings. Generals commanded armies that could rival the authority of the throne. Even within his court, advisors and eunuchs began to manipulate decisions for their own gain. Darius's brilliance gave Persia strength, but it also gave betrayal fertile ground to grow. And betrayal did grow. Revolts broke out across the empire as soon as he took the throne. In Babylon, in Media, in Egypt, leaders declared independence, claiming they had the right to rule themselves. Each time, Darius crushed them with ruthless efficiency. His armies were unstoppable, his will unshakable, but the rebellions never truly ended. They revealed the truth behind the grandeur. Persia's unity was always fragile, always dependent on the strength of one man at the top. Even beyond his borders, Darius faced betrayal. To the west lay the Greeks, small city-states constantly fighting among themselves. Darius saw them as little more than a nuisance, but when the Ionian Greeks, under Persian rule, rebelled, Athens stepped in to support them. That single act ignited a conflict that would define Persia for generations. Darius launched his invasion of Greece, determined to teach them a lesson. At first, success seemed certain, but in 490 BCE, at the Battle of Marathon, the Persians suffered a stunning defeat at the hands of a much smaller Greek force. For the first time, the empire's aura of invincibility cracked. Darius had conquered vast lands, created systems that would inspire empires for centuries, and carved his name into the world. But he could not escape betrayal, not from within his court, not from his satraps, and not from the Greeks who dared to defy him. Imagine the weight he carried. A king who transformed Persia into the most advanced empire of its time, yet constantly looking over his shoulder. Could he trust his satraps? Could he trust his generals? Could he even trust his own family? The same system that gave him control also gave his enemies the tools to undermine him. And that was the paradox of Darius. A visionary who built the empire's foundations stronger than ever, but who also revealed just how fragile those foundations truly were. His reign showed that Persia could rise to heights unimaginable, and that it could just as easily fracture from within. When Darius died, the empire was at its peak, but it was also a house built on fault lines, waiting for the next tremor to shake it apart. That tremor came with his son, Xerxes, a man who inherited the empire's vast power, but also its endless betrayals. If you thought Persia's future was secure under Xerxes, think again. In the next chapter we enter the wars with Greece, where pride, glory and ruin would collide, and where betrayal would no longer be whispered in court, but written in blood on the battlefield. Xerxes stepped onto the throne with a legacy to prove. He was the son of Darius, inheritor of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, commander of the largest armies the world had ever seen. From the very beginning, one goal burned in his mind: to succeed where his father had failed, to crush Greece and restore Persia's unshakable aura of dominance. But what unfolded instead was a saga of ambition, pride and ruin, a story where betrayal was not hidden in shadows, but exposed in fire and steel. The Persian invasion of Greece was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Xerxes assembled an army so vast that Greek storytellers swore it drank rivers dry as it marched. Herodotus claimed millions, though the true number was far less. Still, it was an ocean of men, soldiers from every corner of the empire, from Egypt to India, united under the command of the great king. Alongside them came a massive fleet, hundreds of ships that could blanket the sea itself. The invasion was not just war, it was theater, a declaration that Persia's will was unstoppable. At first, the Persians seemed destined for victory. They marched through Thrace, crossed bridges Xerxes built over the Hellespont, and stormed into Greece with overwhelming force. Resistance seemed futile. But then came Thermopylae. It was here that a small band of Greek warriors, led by King Leonidas of Sparta, made their stand. For 3 days they held the narrow pass against wave after wave of Persian soldiers. The Persians had numbers, they had strength, but the Greeks had resolve and knowledge of the land. What finally broke the stalemate was betrayal. A Greek traitor, Ephialtes, revealed to Xerxes a hidden path around the pass. With this, the Persians outflanked Leonidas, surrounding the Spartans and cutting them down. Thermopylae became a Persian victory, but one tainted by treachery. And more importantly, it gave Greece a symbol of defiance that would echo through the ages. After Thermopylae, Xerxes burned Athens to the ground. Flames devoured temples, statues, and homes, a punishment meant to break Greek spirit. Yet instead of surrender, it hardened their resolve. Athens might have been in ashes, but its people were not defeated. They lured Xerxes into his next great trial, the naval battle of Salamis. Here, pride met ruin. Confident in his massive fleet, Xerxes believed sheer numbers would crush the Greeks. But the Greeks knew their seas, and their smaller ships were faster, more agile. In the cramped straits of Salamis, Persian numbers became a curse. The fleet tangled itself, ships colliding, oars splintering, chaos spreading. Greek vessels rammed into the Persians, sinking ship after ship. From his golden throne on a nearby hill, Xerxes watched in horror as his navy, the pride of his empire, was torn apart before his eyes. Salamis shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility. The once unstoppable tide of Xerxes' army was forced to retreat. Persia remained powerful, but the Greeks had proven that even the greatest empire could bleed, and that proof would echo forward, eventually paving the way for Alexander's revenge generations later. But here's the deeper truth. Xerxes' campaign was not just undone by Greek courage or clever strategy. It was undone by his own pride. He believed the sheer weight of his empire could crush a smaller, fractured people. He underestimated their unity, their desperation, their will to fight. In his hubris, he turned a military campaign into a test of character, and it was character that the Greeks possessed in abundance. Back in Persia, the cost of Xerxes' failure rippled through the empire. The treasury was strained. Satraps grumbled. Nobles whispered. The defeats in Greece did more than dent Persian pride. They weakened faith in the king's destiny. And when faith in the great king faltered, betrayal was never far behind. The wars with Greece became a turning point. Persia was still vast, still rich, still powerful, but the world now knew it could be challenged. The cracks that Darius had tried to cover were widening. Xerxes had reached for eternal glory, but what he found was a reminder of Persia's mortality. And from this moment, the empire was no longer just fighting outsiders. It was also fighting itself. The next stage of Persia's story takes us back inside the court, where the masks of loyalty slipped, and betrayal among family would tear at the empire's heart. If the wars with Greece exposed Persia's vulnerability on the battlefield, what happened inside the royal court revealed something even more dangerous. For empires can withstand foreign enemies, but when betrayal comes from within, from one's own blood, it corrodes the very foundation of power. And the Achaemenid dynasty, from Xerxes onward, was scarred by the bitter truth that the deadliest enemy of a king was often his own family. In Persia, succession was both strength and curse. Unlike kingdoms where the crown passed neatly to the eldest son, Persian kings often left behind multiple wives, concubines, and children, each with a claim, each backed by powerful factions of nobles or generals. The moment a king died, the court did not mourn. It calculated which prince would rise, which mother's son would wear the crown, and which blood would spill in the process. Take Xerxes himself. After his failed campaigns in Greece, whispers filled the palace. His prestige had dimmed, his aura of invincibility tarnished. And in 465 BCE, betrayal struck. Xerxes was assassinated in his own palace, likely by a court official named Artabanus, aided by eunuchs who controlled the royal chambers. The king, who commanded millions, who marched with the largest army the world had known, fell not on the battlefield, but in the silence of his own home, betrayed by those who served him food and carried his messages. But betrayal did not end with his death. A struggle for succession erupted immediately. His son Artaxerxes I emerged as king, but not without bloodshed. Some accounts say Artabanus tried to seize the throne himself, only to be struck down. Others suggest that Xerxes' sons turned on one another, each vying for supremacy, while nobles chose sides in the chaos. The exact details blur in history, but the truth remains clear. The royal family's bonds of blood could not withstand the pull of power. This pattern repeated again and again. After Artaxerxes I, his successors faced similar storms. Siblings clashed in deadly rivalries. Princes were strangled, poisoned, or quietly erased from records to secure one heir's dominance. Even the mighty Darius II, who rose to power later, owed his throne not to orderly succession, but to violent struggle. His reign was marked by the ruthless influence of his queen, Parysatis, who schemed endlessly to secure her favored children's futures, going so far as to orchestrate assassinations within her own family. These betrayals among blood revealed a painful truth about Persian kingship. It was never safe, never stable, never secure. A crown in Persia was not a reward. It was a target. Every brother, every cousin, every ambitious noble in the shadows could be the one sharpening a knife. And when trust died within the royal family, the empire itself suffered. Each bloody transition weakened the chain of command, emboldened satraps to assert independence, and made Persia more vulnerable to outside threats. But perhaps the most infamous of these betrayals came later, in the clash between brothers that defined the reign of Darius II and his sons. One prince would rise to the throne. Another would rebel with the support of foreign allies, dragging Persia into civil war. The empire that once stood united under Cyrus and Darius the Great was now bleeding from wounds inflicted by its own heirs. The tragedy of Persia was that its greatness bred division. The vast wealth of the empire, the splendor of Persepolis, the sheer power of the throne, all of it made the crown irresistible. And when ambition was stronger than blood, betrayal became inevitable. From this point on, Persia was no longer just an empire fighting enemies abroad. It was an empire constantly bleeding from within, struggling to survive the ambitions of its own dynasty. And in that struggle lay the slow unraveling of what had once been the most magnificent empire on earth. In the next chapter, we follow how satraps and generals, empowered by royal weakness, began to act as kings in their own right. The empire's pillars, meant to hold it steady, would instead pull it apart. When Cyrus built the Persian Empire, he understood one thing clearly: you cannot rule the world alone. That's why he created the satrap system. Powerful governors, stationed in every corner of the empire, tasked with collecting tribute, keeping order, and ensuring loyalty to the crown. On paper, it was genius. The empire stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, and these satraps acted like the king's eyes and ears, ruling locally while paying homage to the throne. But over time, what was meant to be a lifeline turned into a noose around Persia's neck. Imagine being a satrap in Asia Minor or Egypt. You lived far from Persepolis, commanded your own army, and collected more wealth in a year than most kings in history ever saw in a lifetime. At first, you sent a share to the royal treasury and pledged loyalty to the king. But as generations passed and central power weakened, that loyalty became negotiable. Kings came and went. Brothers killed brothers. Courtiers whispered in shadows. But you, the satrap, remained, rich and entrenched, your loyalty up for sale to the highest bidder. History records this shift in chilling detail. Some satraps openly rebelled, declaring themselves kings in their own provinces. Others played double games, sending tribute to the Persian king while secretly negotiating with enemies like Athens or Sparta. The empire's vast wealth, once its strength, became a bargaining chip that foreign powers eagerly exploited. A Persian satrap in Ionia could funnel silver to Greek mercenaries one year, then turn against them the next. Loyalty was no longer to Persia, but to personal survival. And it wasn't only satraps. Generals, too, learned the dangerous art of selling their swords. The Persian army was legendary for its size: the immortals, the cavalry, the chariots, and endless waves of soldiers from every land. But beneath that grandeur lay a fragile truth. Many of these soldiers fought not for honor, not for Persia, but for pay. Mercenaries from Greece filled Persian ranks. Entire campaigns were fought with hired hands who shifted sides as easily as the wind. Take the story of Cyrus the Younger, brother to King Artaxerxes II. When he sought to overthrow his sibling, he didn't rely on Persian loyalty. He hired 10,000 Greek mercenaries to march with him deep into Persian territory. Though Cyrus died in battle, his mercenary army, abandoned, leaderless, stranded in hostile land, still fought its way back to Greece in one of history's most legendary retreats. The episode revealed a painful truth. Persian generals could no longer rely on their own men. They needed foreigners to fight their wars, and foreigners could never be trusted. This erosion of loyalty cut deep. How can an empire endure when its governors act like kings and its armies fight for the highest bidder? Persia's rulers tried to patch the cracks with bribes, marriages and assassinations, but the trust that once bound Cyrus's creation together was gone. What remained was an empire that looked mighty on the surface, but inside it was hollowed out by greed, betrayal and disunity. The satraps and generals became both the empire's shield and its dagger. Their power could protect Persia in times of unity, but in moments of weakness it was they who carved away its strength. By the time Alexander the Great rose in the west, Persia was already fractured, its loyalty bought and sold too many times to resist him with one heart. But before Alexander appeared, another shadow loomed over Persia, a shadow from within the royal family itself. For the rivalry between princes and the manipulation of ambitious queens would plunge the empire into one of its darkest chapters. A civil war where betrayal was not only expected, but guaranteed. If the satraps and generals weakened Persia's body, the blood feud between brothers tore out its heart. Few stories in Persian history are as dramatic, tragic and revealing as the civil war between Artaxerxes II and his younger brother Cyrus the Younger. It was not merely a quarrel over succession. It was the moment Persia turned its sword inward, cutting itself open for the world to see. Artaxerxes II inherited the throne after the assassination of his father, Darius II, in 404 BCE. But his younger brother, Cyrus, ambitious and restless, believed he was more worthy. He had been his mother's favorite, trained in command, and trusted with military authority. To Cyrus, his elder brother was weak, indecisive, and unfit to rule. And in Persia, where succession often blurred between bloodlines and ambition, such a belief was not treason. It was a dangerous invitation to rebellion. Cyrus gathered allies, and here's where the story takes its shocking turn. He didn't rely on Persian loyalty. He didn't trust the satraps or noblemen who shifted allegiance with the seasons. Instead, he turned to outsiders, Greek mercenaries hardened by endless wars. Among them were the famous 10,000, men of Sparta and Athens, who had once fought each other, but now fought for Persian gold. To Cyrus, they were not just soldiers, they were his ticket to the throne. In 401 BCE, the brothers met in the decisive Battle of Cunaxa, near Babylon. Imagine the scene, tens of thousands of troops clashing under the blazing sun, dust rising, war cries filling the air. On one side, Artaxerxes with the weight of imperial Persia at his back. On the other, Cyrus with his hired Greeks, a smaller but disciplined force. And in the chaos, the unthinkable happened. Cyrus, desperate to strike the killing blow, charged straight at his brother. He broke through the ranks, found Artaxerxes, and in that furious clash, Cyrus was struck down. The dream of kingship died with him. But the story didn't end there. What followed was perhaps even more telling. The Greek mercenaries, suddenly leaderless in the heart of enemy territory, refused to surrender. Abandoned by Persian allies, who melted away, they fought their way back across mountains and rivers, in a legendary march that became known as the Anabasis. Their survival proved not just their resilience, but Persia's fragility. A foreign army, deep in Persian lands, could not be crushed outright. The empire that once swept across continents could not even cage a band of mercenaries. For Artaxerxes II, victory at Cunaxa was hollow. He had killed his brother, but in doing so he revealed to the world the deep fractures in Persia's soul. He remained king, but his reign was haunted by rebellion, satrap uprisings, and the constant suspicion that betrayal lurked in every shadow. The empire that once projected unshakable unity was now exposed as divided, vulnerable, and bleeding from within. The brothers' war was not just a family tragedy. It was a turning point. It showed that Persia's greatest threat was no longer Greece, nor Egypt, nor even Alexander, who was yet to come. Persia's greatest enemy was itself. And once an empire begins to destroy itself from the inside, no army on earth can save it. From here, Persia stumbled forward, powerful still but scarred. Its kings fought not only enemies at the borders, but rebellions in the provinces, treachery in the palace, and ghosts of brothers slain in civil war. It was a path that led, step by step, toward decline. Next, we'll uncover how the cracks widened even further when Egypt, long held as a jewel of the empire, slipped from Persia's grasp, a loss that revealed just how much control was slipping away. For centuries, Egypt had been more than just another province of Persia. It was the empire's breadbasket, its wealth of grain feeding armies and cities across the vast dominion. To control Egypt was to control life itself, but to lose Egypt, that was to expose the empire's fragility to the world. And in the 4th century BCE, Persia discovered just how dangerous that loss could be. When Persia first conquered Egypt under Cambyses II, son of Cyrus, it was a moment of triumph. The pharaohs had ruled for thousands of years, but now their crowns were forced beneath the shadow of the Persian kings. Cambyses even styled himself as pharaoh, adopting Egyptian rituals to legitimize his rule. On the surface, it seemed Egypt was fully absorbed into the empire, but beneath the monuments and ceremonies, resentment smoldered. Egyptians never saw the Persians as rightful rulers. They saw them as occupiers. By the time Artaxerxes II sat on the throne, Egypt was restless, waiting for the right moment to break free. And that moment came. Native pharaohs rose again, rallying their people under the banner of independence. Persia, already drained by the civil war between Artaxerxes and Cyrus, could not strike back with the force it once commanded. Rebellions flared, and this time they did not die quietly. Egypt declared independence around 404 BCE, and for decades afterward, Persia tried desperately to retake it. Expedition after expedition was launched. Persian generals marched south, Greek mercenaries were hired, alliances with Sparta and other city-states were forged. Yet every attempt failed. Egyptian kings like Nekhti-Nebo the Head and later Nekhti-Nebo the Hettin fortified their lands, sometimes with the help of Greek advisors and soldiers who knew how to outmaneuver Persia's vast but cumbersome armies. The symbolism of this loss was devastating. Egypt was not just another territory, it was ancient, revered, and immensely wealthy. For Persia to hold Egypt meant legitimacy. To lose it meant weakness. Every time the Persians failed to reclaim it, their aura of invincibility dimmed. To their subjects across the empire, from Babylon to Asia Minor, it sent a dangerous message. The great king could be defied, and the longer Egypt remained free, the more Persia's enemies grew bolder. Satraps in Asia Minor whispered of independence. Greek city-states, once humbled by Persia's gold and armies, saw that the empire could stumble. Even allies began to weigh their loyalties more carefully. Egypt's independence was more than a rebellion. It was a crack in the facade of imperial control. Perhaps the cruelest twist is this. Persia did eventually reclaim Egypt, but only briefly under Artaxerxes III. His reconquest in the 340s BCE seemed like a return to former glory, yet it was too late. The empire was already weakened, drained by decades of civil wars, betrayals and satrap rebellions. And when Alexander the Great marched into Egypt not long after, Persia could not hold it. The jewel slipped away again, this time forever. The loss of Egypt revealed the empire's new reality. Persia was no longer the unstoppable juggernaut of Cyrus or Darius. It was an empire that could be challenged, defied, and humiliated. And once the illusion of invincibility breaks, even the greatest empire begins to crumble. From here, Persia faced new challenges, not only from rebellious provinces, but from foreign powers rising stronger every year. Greece was no longer fractured. Under Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, it was uniting with a single terrifying purpose, to take on Persia itself. For more than a century, Persia had cast a long shadow over Greece. Its gold-funded wars, its armies intimidated kings, its envoys reminded the Greeks of their smallness. Even after defeats at Marathon, Salamis and Plataea, Persia found ways to control Greece through bribery, alliances, and manipulation. But by the mid-4th century BCE, the balance of power had shifted. The storm gathering in Macedonia would soon crash against Persia with a force unlike anything it had faced before. At first, the Persians hardly noticed Macedonia. It was a rugged northern kingdom, dismissed as barbaric by the great cities of Athens and Sparta. But Philip II changed everything. Through cunning diplomacy, ruthless warfare, and sheer brilliance, he united the fractious Greek states under his banner. For the first time in history, the Greeks were no longer squabbling city-states. They were a single force, aimed like a spear, and Persia was the target. Persia by this time was stumbling. Egypt had broken free. Satraps were restless. Succession struggles bled the royal family. Artaxerxes III briefly restored some stability, even retaking Egypt, but his reign ended in poison, another assassination within the palace walls. His successor, Darius III, inherited not the empire of Cyrus, but a weakened shadow of it. The timing could not have been worse. When Philip was assassinated, his son Alexander took the throne. Young, untested but burning with ambition, Alexander vowed to avenge the Persian invasions of Greece. But this was not merely revenge. This was conquest, and he had something the Persians no longer possessed: unity of purpose. The clash came quickly. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor, at the Granicus River. His army, smaller, outnumbered, but fiercely disciplined, smashed a Persian force commanded by satraps. The defeat was more than tactical. It was symbolic. For centuries, Persia had dictated terms in Asia Minor. Now a foreign king marched through with impunity, but the true storm struck at Issus in 333 BC. Darius III himself faced Alexander, bringing a massive army said to dwarf the Macedonian force. By all logic, Persia should have crushed him. Instead, Alexander's bold tactics and relentless charge broke the Persian lines. Darius fled the battlefield, leaving behind not just his army but his own family. The King of Kings, descendant of Cyrus and Darius the Great, reduced to a fugitive in his own empire. This was the turning point. Once the aura of Persian supremacy cracked, the empire unraveled with startling speed. Cities opened their gates to Alexander. Satraps who once swore loyalty to Darius now courted the Macedonian conqueror. Even Egypt, long a point of rebellion, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. The storm that had gathered in Macedonia swept across Persia, unstoppable. Yet this was not merely a story of battles. It was a story of contrast. On one side, Alexander, young, hungry, united with his people in a shared vision. On the other, Persia, vast, wealthy but divided, betrayed and exhausted. In that clash, numbers and riches meant nothing. What mattered was will. And Persia had lost its will long before Alexander crossed the Hellespont. The Macedonian storm revealed the empire's deepest truth, that it was already collapsing from within. Alexander did not destroy Persia. He only pushed against a wall that was already crumbling. But even after defeat, the Persian story did not end. For in the ashes of empire, a question remained. What became of the dynasties, the rulers, the heirs of Cyrus and Xerxes? Did they vanish into history's shadows, or did they fight to reclaim the throne? When Alexander's armies stormed Persepolis and the palaces burned, it seemed as if Persia's story had ended. The empire that Cyrus had built and Darius had expanded was reduced to ruins, its treasures plundered, its kings defeated. But history rarely ends so neatly. The dynasties of Persia did not vanish overnight. They lived on, fighting, adapting, and in some cases, reclaiming fragments of the greatness they had lost. After the death of Darius III, the last Achaemenid king, Alexander took control of Persia's heartlands. Yet even he understood the weight of the Persian legacy. He adopted Persian dress, married Persian nobles, and attempted to merge Greek and Persian cultures. But this was not acceptance. It was appropriation. For many Persians, Alexander was still a foreign conqueror. His empire might have been vast, but it was fragile, built on his charisma alone. When he died young in 323 BCE, the question of Persia's future re-emerged. The first answer came in the form of the Seleucid dynasty, one of the successor states carved out of Alexander's empire. Greek in origin, but ruling from Persian lands, the Seleucids inherited much of the Achaemenid infrastructure. Yet they were never truly Persian. Their rule carried the scent of foreign dominance, and resistance smoldered in the east. In time, native dynasties rose again, determined to restore something of Persia's old pride. Among them was the Parthian Empire, founded by a nomadic people from the northeast. By the 2nd century BCE, they had expelled the Seleucids from much of Persia and established their own dynasty. The Parthians were not Achaemenids, but they understood the value of continuity. They styled themselves as heirs to Cyrus and Darius, guardians of Persian identity against the Greeks and Romans. For centuries they battled Rome, proving that Persia, though transformed, was not dead. Later still came the Sasanian dynasty, rising in the 3rd century CE. They were Persians through and through, proud of their heritage, eager to reclaim the glory of their ancestors. Under kings like Shapur I and Khusro Sas, the Sasanians built a state that rivaled Rome itself, blending ancient traditions with new vigor. Their empire stood for over 400 years, long enough to remind the world that Persia was more than a memory. But even with these revivals, the shadow of betrayal and loss lingered. Each dynasty that followed carried the scars of the Achaemenid collapse. They ruled in the name of Persia, yet always with the knowledge that the first, greatest empire had fallen not simply to Alexander's brilliance, but to its own divisions, its own betrayals, its own lost unity. And so the dynasties of Persia, though scattered and reshaped, became symbols of resilience. They proved that an empire can fall, but a civilization endures. The palaces of Persepolis may lie in ruins, but the spirit of Persia lived on, in language, in culture, in memory, and in every dynasty that tried to revive its flame. The Persian story, then, is not one of simple rise and fall. It is a cycle of triumph, betrayal, collapse, and rebirth. From Cyrus to Darius, from Alexander to the Parthians, from Rome to the Sasanians, Persia's identity never truly disappeared. It adapted, it survived, it returned. And even now, when we speak of empires, when we marvel at vast domains that stretch across continents, we are echoing the story first written by Cyrus the Great. Persia was the blueprint. Persia was the warning. Persia was the dream that kingdoms still chase, and the cautionary tale they often forget. Next, we'll bring everything together. The lessons of Persia, its betrayals, its lost dynasties, and its enduring legacy still speak to us today, because in the end, the story of Persia is not just ancient history. It is the story of power itself. Every empire in history tells us something about ourselves. Rome showed us the dangers of overextension. The Mongols revealed the unstoppable force of unity on horseback. But Persia showed us something deep. It showed us the beauty of vision and the tragedy of betrayal. It showed us how greatness can rise from a single idea and collapse when trust shatters. Cyrus the Great dreamed of an empire, not built solely on fear, but on respect. He allowed conquered peoples to keep their traditions, their languages, their gods. His empire was vast, but it was also humane, at least by the standards of its time. And because of that vision, Persia thrived. For a moment it seemed the dream could last forever. But empires do not live on dreams alone. They live or die by the loyalty of those within them. The betrayals that haunted Persia, from assassins in the palace, to satraps selling their loyalty, to brothers raising arms against brothers, were not accidents. They were symptoms. They revealed the truth that an empire cannot survive when unity is lost. When power becomes personal instead of collective, when ambition outweighs loyalty, the cracks begin to spread. Persia's fall was not just the triumph of Alexander's genius. It was the consequence of years of blood spilled inside its own walls. It was Egypt breaking free, satraps turning traitor, generals fighting for pay rather than honor. By the time the Macedonian storm arrived, Persia was already bleeding from within. Alexander did not destroy a healthy empire. He pushed down a giant that was already crumbling. And yet, the Persian story is not only one of failure, it is also one of resilience. For even after the Achaemenids fell, Persia rose again and again in the Parthians, in the Sasanians, in countless dynasties that carried forward its language, its culture, its pride. No conqueror could erase it. Not Alexander, not Rome, not centuries of war. Persia endured because its identity was stronger than any single empire. What then is the lesson? That power without unity is fragile. That betrayal from within is deadlier than any enemy from without. That empires rise not only on conquest but on trust. And when that trust dies, no walls, no armies, no treasures can save them. But Persia also leaves us with hope. Because even in the ashes of betrayal, even in the ruins of Persepolis, the story did not end. The Persian spirit carried forward, shaping the world in ways we still feel today. Its roads became the pathways of trade. Its kings inspired legends. Its vision of tolerance influenced rulers long after the empire itself was gone. And perhaps that is why Persia still matters, because its rise and fall are not just ancient history. They are a mirror. Every nation, every power, every civilization faces the same choice: to build on unity or to collapse under betrayal. This is the story of the Persian Empire. But its final chapter, it was written not by kings or conquerors, but by betrayal, ambition, and the slow collapse of trust. If this journey revealed a side of history you never learned before, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden truths of the past. And as we look to our own age of artificial intelligence, technology, and global power, Persia's rise and fall offers a timeless warning. Strength alone is never enough. What holds empires together is trust. Once it fractures, even the mightiest can crumble. The Persians teach us that history doesn't repeat itself, it cautions us. And the warning they left behind is one we cannot afford to ignore.